Thank you for joining me as we take a look at the 7 signs in the Gospel of John. My prayer is that our faith is growing with each of these lessons, our faith in Jesus, that we are finding that we are able to trust in Him more and rely upon Him and accept His words and even act upon His words. Because we remember this is why John includes the signs in his Gospel account of the life of Jesus. He wants to create faith in us. So I hope your faith is growing with each one of these lessons. Now, we've looked at the first 2 signs in the Gospel of John, the turning of water into wine and the healing of the official's son. I hope that you were impressed with what you learned about Jesus from those signs. I know that I was. In fact, Jesus continues to impress and amaze me more and more every day. Today, we want to take a look at the 3rd sign in John's Gospel, the healing of the lame man by the pool of Bethzatha. My plan in this message is for us to do what we have done in the previous 2 signs, to examine what we learn about Jesus from this story. But then I want us to discuss what we may learn about ourselves from this story. That's right. I think looking into this text is like looking into a mirror. If we dare to look into this mirror with the purpose of seeing ourselves as we really are, there is much that we can learn about ourselves in this story. Now, before we consider what John wants us to share or wants to share with us about Jesus, and perhaps the deeper meaning of this 3rd sign, let's read the text. Here is John chapter 5, verses 1 through 18. After this there was a festival of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now in Jerusalem, by the sheep gate, there is a pool, called in Hebrew Bethzatha, which has 5 porticos. In these lay many invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. One man was there who had been ill for 38 years. And Jesus saw him lying there, and He knew that he had been there a long time. And He said to him, "Do you want to be made well?" The sick man answered Him, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. And while I am making my way, someone else steps down ahead of me." Jesus said to him, "Stand up, take your mat, and walk." At once the man was made well, and he took up his mat and began to walk. Now that was a Sabbath day. So the Jews said to the man who had been cured, "It is the Sabbath. It is not lawful for you to carry your mat." But He answered them, "The man who made me well said to me, 'Take up your mat and walk.'" They asked Him, "Who is this man who said to you, 'Take it up and walk'?" Now the man who had been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had disappeared in the crowd that was there. Later, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "See, you have been made well. Do not sin any more, so that nothing worse happens to you." The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had made him well. Therefore, the Jews started persecuting Jesus because He was doing such things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, "My Father is still working, and I also am working." For this reason, the Jews were seeking all the more to kill Him, because He was not only breaking the Sabbath, but was also calling God His own Father, thereby making Himself equal to God. Well, let's talk first about what we might learn about Jesus from this particular sign. Let's start with the obvious. John tells us that Jesus is in Jerusalem. He tells us that there's a place there called the Sheep Gate, and by that location there is a pool called Bethzatha. By the way, I love all the place names in this text. Our historian gives us so many details, doesn't he? I don't know about you, but all of these specific place names and details assure me that John is telling us what actually happened, that it is highly improbable that his story is a fabrication. John tells us that this pool has 5 porticos. Again, more detail. This is an historical account, my friends. And in these porticos or porches lay many invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. Among those who lay there was a man who had been ill for 38 years. The text says that Jesus saw him and knew that he had been there a long time. Verse 8 says that Jesus said to the man, "Stand up, take your mat, and walk." And at once the man was made well and took up his mat and began to walk. Now, what obvious truth do we learn about Jesus here? As we learn from the first 2 signs, so in this sign, we learn that God is at work in and through Jesus. Now, why do I make that claim? First, because this man had been ill for 38 long years. Note that Jesus' power was not limited by the length of this man's illness. Second, the healing was instantaneous. For 38 years, this man had been bedridden, but in a split second, at Jesus' word, he stands, picks up his mat, and walks. Third, it is noteworthy that this miracle is unsolicited. There is no evidence at all that this man even knew who was speaking with him or who Jesus was. He certainly did not anticipate this healing. And finally, it is so interesting to me that Jesus' opponents do not deny that a miracle occurred. What is their beef? It is that it occurred on a Sabbath day. And think about this for a moment. Never was there anyone who doubted that Jesus exercised power to heal. So, for the 3rd time now, we have learned that Jesus is a compassionate healer. But there is more that we learn about Jesus in this story. Did you know that it was not Jesus' usual procedure to seek out people to heal? Rather, they came to Him, seeking a cure for their maladies. They sought Him out. Well, there is one exception to this general rule. When a healing was done on the Sabbath, all 4 of the Gospels stress that Jesus deliberately sought out opportunities to heal on the Sabbath. In Mark 3, Jesus entered a synagogue on the Sabbath and found a man with a withered hand and cured him. In Luke 13, Jesus was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath, and there appeared a woman with a spirit that had crippled her for 18 years. And when he saw her, he called her over and said, "Woman, you are set free from your ailment." And in Luke 14, Jesus was going to the house of a leader of the Pharisees to eat a meal on the Sabbath. In front of him there was a man who had dropsy, the text says, and Jesus asked the religious leaders who were there, "Is it lawful to cure people on the Sabbath or not?" They were silent. Jesus took the man, healed him, and sent him away. It's hard for us to underestimate how important Sabbath observance was to Jews. Along with circumcision and keeping kosher, it was seen as one of the most crucial marks of being Jewish. Yet Jesus felt free to act in ways that He knew would be seen as deliberate violations of the Sabbath. Think about this. This man whom Jesus healed in our story had had his problem for some 38 years. 38 years. Clearly, his healing could have waited one more day. And yet Jesus chose to act on this particular day, a Sabbath day. Have you heard before of the Mishnah? The Mishnah is the oral law in Judaism, as opposed to the written law or the Torah or the Mosaic law as we know it. The Mishnah was collected and committed to writing about AD 200. The Mishnah was quite clear that carrying any burden on the Sabbath day was explicitly prohibited. Thus, in the eyes of the religious leaders of Jesus' day, Jesus was not only violating the Sabbath by healing someone on that particular day, but in this case, he would be seen as encouraging this man to violate the Sabbath too by carrying his mat. Now, what might explain Jesus' behavior? He may have believed that his ministry was bringing out the true intent and meaning of the Sabbath rest, namely, relieving people from their burdens. Thus, healing on the Sabbath was carrying out part of the original intent of God's Sabbath law. But I suspect that more than likely, this is just another example of John's theme, that Jesus came to replace the institutions of Judaism with something he has to offer that is superior, better, more lasting. This is probably the deeper meaning that John wants us to see. Again, Jesus came to bring in the new. And notice how the Jews responded to Jesus' deliberate challenge to their understanding of the Sabbath. Take a look at verses 16 through 18. In those verses, John seems to be telling us that the trial of Jesus unofficially began right here, with the third sign. And what? From this point on, the Jews seek to kill Jesus. And why? Because he claimed a special relationship with God the Father. To explain and justify why he healed on the Sabbath, Jesus said, "My Father is still working, and I also am working." He called God his own Father and made himself equal to God. That's verse 18. Without a doubt then, Jesus saw himself as God's agent, God's unique agent, the only Son of the Father, commissioned by the Father to convey God's life to human beings. So from this story, we learn that God is working in and through Jesus. Okay. But what is the second thing we learn about him? This is what jumps out at me. Jesus was a revolutionary. Dare I say, Jesus was almost a rebel in his day. For sure, Jesus was unafraid to make a ruckus, if you will. Jesus could not but speak against the religious leaders of his day when he saw how their man-made rules had created a religion that was onerous and burdensome, and not at all as God had intended. He was unafraid to challenge the status quo, especially when he saw injustice and abuse. Now we know what God thinks about justice and fairness, and from the Old Testament we learn that not only is God just, but he wants us to treat each other with justice and fairness. And when Jesus saw how people were abused and treated unjustly by such a flawed interpretation of the Sabbath law, he deliberately challenged it, the law and the status quo. You know, we call Jesus the Prince of Peace, and so he is. He came to bring about a lasting peace between each one of us and our God. But let's not miss how he was in certain situations, such as we have in our story today. He was forthright, challenging, even threatening of the religion of his day. In our day and time, we might say that to some extent Jesus was a bit divisive as he comes into these synagogues on Sabbath days and does what he knows will deliberately upset people. Jesus was a revolutionary, who was unafraid of making a ruckus when the situation called for it. But I promised you that we would take a look at what we might learn from this story, what we might learn about ourselves. And now, before my time with you runs out, I want to make good on that promise. What might we learn about ourselves from this sign? When Jesus sees this man who lay by the pool and knew that he had been there a long time, he asks him an intriguing question. Do you want to be made well? Do you want to be made whole? Considering the context of the scene, Jesus' question has the grace of the proverbial bull in the china closet. It seems unnecessary, even heartless, not at all in keeping with the sensitivity Jesus usually showed in his dealings with people. Wasn't it obvious this man wanted to be healed? Why else would he be there? Why then did Jesus ask him if he wanted to be healed? Because Jesus is realistic. He does not assume that a person's desires are what they appear to be on the surface. That's why he asked the lame man if he wanted to walk again. It was necessary. That man had to know for sure what he wanted before Jesus could help him. After all, he had been paralyzed for 38 years. 38 long years. And much of that time had been spent there beside this pool, just waiting. Something may have happened during those years, something he himself may have failed to recognize. Being sick demanded an adjustment. It had not been easy to make, but once made and long accepted, it might be extremely difficult to readjust to the demands and responsibilities of good health and physical vigor. Look at it this way. Life at Bethzatha had its compensations. It was not altogether unpleasant to lie there in the cool porches beside the pool while healthy men were toiling outside under the blazing hot sun. Everyone who looked at him could see he was helpless, so no one expected anything from him. Kind, generous, benevolent people kept him fed and clothed. The thought of being healthy was appealing, but this life, well, it had its advantages. So you see, Jesus had to ask, did this man really want to be healed, knowing it would demand a radical change in his lifestyle, knowing that he would have to go to work? It was something that had to be considered. Do you want to be healed? What a question. Let's have the courage to let Jesus ask us the same question. Let's try to identify with the lame man, substituting our spiritual needs for his physical infirmity. Let's face the searching implications of the question, do we want to be healed? Do we really want what Jesus is ready to give us, or are we deceiving ourselves about our real desires? Maybe we don't really want what he offers after all. Jesus offers us what money cannot buy. He offers us sufficient resources for handling our needs, freedom from enslaving habits, the rewards of a clear conscience, a sense of purpose, a Christ-like character, the fellowship of His Spirit, a peace and joy that nothing can take from us. All this and more God offers us. So, if we don't have these resources in our lives, what's the problem? Rudyard Kipling used to say that if we haven't gotten from life what we wanted, it is proof that we did not really want it, or else we tried to haggle about the price. Price? Where does price come into the picture? What God offers is something we can neither earn nor buy. Nevertheless, life with Him has a kind of price tag on it. You cannot set your heart upon obtaining the enduring heavenly riches when your life is totally consumed by the things of this world. Here is the reality. Life confronts us with a multiplicity of choices. There are many ways we can go, but the price we pay for going one way is the elimination of being able to go one of the other ways. What is it you want God to give you? You have to really want it. You have to really want it enough to seek it, and to seek it with your whole heart. So, what do you really want? Do we really want what God offers us in Jesus Christ? When will we be free from the habits that enslave us? When will we be mature and responsible Christians? When will the church be able to rise and walk, ready to move out in her mission to bring the good news of salvation to every person who wants to be made whole? The answer is plain. When that is what we want, really want. God's power is present in Jesus to heal us, to enable us to grow to maturity in Christ, and to empower us to take the world. But God will not say, "Rise and walk," until that is what we really want. Do you want it? If so, He is ready to give it.